Those are rough. You're welcome. No, I enjoy being here. I don't
So what we're going to do is
it worked. Battled.
Yes, I know, I have. Negotiations with yeah, it's time, man.
Chief Shannon, can we get started? All right, good evening. Let's call this meeting to order. This is the Finance and Audit Committee meeting for Thursday, October 25th at 2018. Do we have any speakers that want to speak to us tonight?
There are no speakers.
Okay, we'll move on to the consent calendar. Do we have any questions about it?
Nope.
I'll entertain a motion.
Motion to approve.
second.
Wonderful. We've got a motion and a second. Would you call the vote, please?
Director Rosali?
Aye.
Clark?
Aye.
Wood?
Aye.
Motion passes.
Thank you. Presentation items. CFO Thomas, welcome.
Good evening, directors. I'm here this evening to present the financial report for the 2 months ended August 31st, 2018. So that's the first 2 months of the fiscal year 2018-19. The first chart that we're looking at is the district's cash balance, and this is in all district-held funds, so not just the general fund, but all the funds that are held by the district. And the green line is showing the current fiscal year 2018-19, and the red line is showing the previous fiscal year 2017-18. You can see, looking at the green line, the current cash balance as of August 31st is a little over $24 million. That's also an increase over where we were the same point in time the previous fiscal year. Some of that is due to timing issues and will even out as the year goes on. The other thing that I do want to point out on this chart is not in the next report, which will be 2 months from now, but in the one following that, you will see a significant drop in this cash balance number because we will be redeeming pension obligation bonds. So about $25.5 million in November will be redeemed. So that will be a reduction in our cash balance by an equivalent amount. So that will show up in the report that includes the November month. This chart is in a little bit different order than I've had it in previous presentations, but I thought it made sense to talk about here where we are talking about cash. So this is the current balance in the SERPT fund, and that's our OPEB or Retiree Medical Trust Fund. That's not held by the district. It's held by SERPT, so it's not included in the cash balance numbers that we were just looking at. The balance as of August 31st is about $36.6 million. You can see that cumulatively, that's been made up of contributions of a little over $30 million and investment earnings of about $6.5 million. This, just to put in some context, this $36.6 million of assets, of OPEB assets, compares to roughly $200 million in OPEB liability. So turning now to look at our general fund revenues and expenses, this chart is showing us our medic cost recovery revenues. So again, the red line representing the actual amounts for the current fiscal year, so that first 2 months worth of data, you can see that we've collected a little over $6 million. and we are budgeting for a total collection this fiscal year of about $35.5 million. Comparing the red line to that blue budget line, you can see that we are pretty much right on budget for the first 2 months of the year, which is a positive sign for us. And if you recall that last year we trended below budget for most of the year. So while it's only 2 months worth of data, it is looking pretty consistent with our budget. Looking at our total revenues, that red line there, you can see total revenues for the first 2 months in the general fund, $7.2 million. Obviously, most of that is the $6.1 million in medic revenues that we saw on the previous chart. As in these early months in the fiscal year, those make up most of the revenues before we have our first property tax collection. So you can see that that comes in December, where we have that spike up in the revenue line, and then it flattens out a bit until the second installment there in April, and then we anticipate finishing out the year at that budget number of $209 million. Turning now to look at expenses. This chart is showing salaries and benefits expenses. So for the first 2 months, we had about $33.3 million in salaries and benefits expenses. Again, comparing the red line to the blue line, you can see that that is also pretty much right on track with what we are budgeting. We're budgeting for total fiscal year expenditures in salaries and benefits of $173.6 million. And then looking at our total expenses for the first 2 months of the year at $43.3 million. Obviously, the $33 million of salaries and benefits is making up the majority of that as well. And we're budgeting for total expenditures of $208.9 million. So, looking at our revenues and expenses and comparing the two, we get our impact on general fund reserves. So this chart is showing the monthly general fund reserve amount, and you can see that consistent with the prior year, which is the red line, that blue line has been dropping since we started the fiscal year, and that is because for the first part of the fiscal year, before we get our first installment of property taxes, our expenditures outpace our revenues. So as of August 31st, 2018, we had a reserve of negative $11.5 million. Usually when we're talking about reserves in the budget context, we're talking about where do we project that we're going to end the fiscal year. So this fiscal year, we're projecting an ending reserve balance of $25 million, and that's that yellow dashed line there, and that would represent about 12% of net budgeted expenditures. So just as was the case last fiscal year and in prior fiscal years, we would expect this reserve number to decline through November and then go up in December when we have that first installment of property tax revenues, decline again, and then level out at that $25 million number. So in summary, our revenues and expenses are on track with the amounts that we would expect for the first 2 months of the fiscal year based on our budget. Overall, our expenses have exceeded our revenues by $36 million, which is typical for the first 2 months of the year. Our general fund reserves are consistent with the prior year level, and we are expecting an ending reserve balance of $25 million, which represents a 12% reserve ratio. That concludes my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions.
Outstanding. Thank you so much. Do we have any questions, Director?
That's pretty clear.
I guess there is one question. The reserve ratio at 12%. Our stated goal has been 15%, and in my opinion, you've done an absolutely marvelous job of moving toward that number. What do you think? Any way to put your crystal ball hat on and make a prediction about where that's going to head?
So you're correct. The board policy calls for a minimum 15% reserve target. The district has not yet achieved that target, although I think that the 12% does represent an improvement over where the district was 4 or 5 years ago. I think looking ahead over the next 5 years, there are certainly going to be some challenges in increasing that reserve ratio. A lot of the things that we've been talking about in the context of strategic planning and preliminary budgets, on the sort of pension funding side of things, the increased costs that we'll be seeing are certainly going to make it a challenge to add to the reserves, although that remains a goal. So I think the approach that we've been taking is trying to work towards a balanced budget. And if there happen to be additional revenues or unspent expenditures in that budget, that would help to increase the reserve ratio, but we're not budgeting for an increase in the reserve ratio at this point in time.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Thomas. I just want to say one thing. I for one, appreciate having that cert slide early on and the reminder to all of us that we have $247 million in liabilities outstanding for that fund.
It's about $200 million in OPEB liability.
It's great to see the interest income growing on that and see that moving towards at least getting closer.
Yes.
But it just reminds us all how important that arc is.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
I appreciate that. Thank you. All right. Any other items? I'm sorry?
No, motion to adjourn.
We don't meet normally. We don't have board meetings the second meeting in November and December normally. So I think our next meeting will come up in January for this committee. So we will see you then. We're adjourned. Thank you.